let me see. I think I'm live. Okay. So what I'm going to be doing,
Okay, I think I'm live.
I am. There you go. Okay. So I'm going to continue reading from Pete Walker's book, which is The Tao of Fully Feeling. And what's camera? So basically, I'm talking about anxiety as we know it and depression, and how from childhood, many of us don't look back to our childhood because we're told as adults that we should be over, childhood trauma, quite serious childhood trauma. And people don't tend to realize that verbal abuse, sexual abuse or violence plays out in adulthood because we've not processed it as children. When we get to adulthood, we can end up with anxiety and panic attacks, and we don't put two and two together. So what I'm doing is putting psychoeducation out there, which is going to hopefully help people resolve some of their own personal stuff that's going on. I know myself, I didn't go for anxiety pills when I basically had a breakdown in 2016, which was to do with flashback regression from childhood trauma. I basically began to get help. So it's going to be different for each of us. We've all had different levels of child abuse, but going around in adulthood in depression can be really hard for many. And I think that psychoeducation is not out there or easily accessible, and not everybody can afford to go to have therapy. So I'm going to do a bit of reading, and if anybody comes on, the book that I'm reading from, I've read the last 3 days, chapter 8 on my channel. So you can go back to my last 3 videos, and you literally picking up wherever I've stopped reading from yesterday. And as I read it, then I'll stop and, make comments. And then if anybody's got any questions, they're able to basically chat in the chat box to me or ask me any questions. So it's quite a serious subject, and a lot of people don't want to comment on live streams. So I'm over on Facebook, and you can hit the notification button because I'm going to be doing this regular throughout the coming months, weeks, and probably years. And because it's part of what my passion is to help people overcome childhood trauma and abuse that's been had, to get rid of complex PTSD, not to get rid of it, but to heal it. Okay, so here goes. I'm on page 179 of The Tao of Fully Feeling by Pete Walker. And he says here, whether or not we are aware of it, we still register hurt at the core of our being when we are unfairly teased. So he's speaking about how verbal abuse affects us in childhood. He says, I see this over and over in my private practice when clients finally remember and relive the pain of being traumatically teased in childhood. So this could be by parents or it could be in schools, but as an example. Such recollections often come from deep grieving releases of the hurt they are too humiliated to express at the time. He says, I once witnessed a particularly dismaying example of this in a rugged, hardened old man who was remembered being cruelly teased by 2 older boys in childhood. He cried silently for a long time as he recalled the pain of their taunting and their decision he made at the time to forevermore harden himself with a facade of toughness. He was profoundly aggrieved as he realized the tremendous sacrifice of closeness and affection that it had cost him. So a lot of people, when we've been abused as children, will, as adults, stay away from people, will isolate. And because people get triggered, they don't want to be out in the world. You might have social anxiety. You might not be able to operate in the world fully and have a normal job, or, you basically don't decide not to have friends. And this all goes back to having an abusive childhood and not resolving it. And the beauty of resolving it now is that when we're older, that we're not sitting there, at 80 years old having to grieve. And we need to stop suppressing what we do feel. A lot of people are told to get over it, let it go, forgive. Particularly when the abuse has come from parents, people expect people to be over it because the wounds are not seen, by looking at somebody. They're deep within us. And a lot of people go into dissociation. Myself, I used alcohol for years, probably from the age of 30 until about 46. And I stopped drinking when I was in 2012 because it was very damaging to me. And when I stopped disassociating using alcohol, and I will say I used alcohol. Some people will use food, and people use all sorts of things to disassociate their feelings or pretend they're okay when they're not okay. And there's a lot of people that have ungrieved childhood wounds, and some of the wounding was horrific for many, many people. And Pete Walker says 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 5 boys have been through sexual abuse, violence, verbal abuse, and such like. And often they go hand in hand. It's not one or the other. It generally is a mix of abuse, and it seems quite rife in this world. Continuing reading. He says, if only he had had a parent trustworthy enough to go and comfort him when he was first wounded by being teased. If only he had had a parent caring and wise enough to reassure him that it was the older boys who should be ashamed, not he. If only he had been able to cry out his pain instead of walling it off and entombing himself in the loneliness of the tough guy defense. As I write this, I feel fortunate that I have only had to live half my life in defense. I hope I will always have a tender place of self-compassion for the stark loneliness, like the aforementioned man marred my early life with so much unnecessary isolation and gloom. So, for many people have their entire lives as children wiped out. It's only when they leave home they begin to get a life, where there's heavy abuse. A lot of people, for me, I left home at 14 and a half. And, for many people that have had, ongoing abuse, it's only when they leave home. But for years, it takes many people to get to their 50 to begin to process the deep pain and wounding of their childhood. So he says, as I reminisce further about those times, I recall the first time I was beaten up outside my family in childhood. I had wandered into the wrong neighborhood and was beaten so badly that I was bleeding from both the outside and inside of my nose. The physical pain of this was minor. However, compared to the shame I felt, I knew that if anyone saw or heard about my thrashing, I would be mocked about it forever. He says here, I slunk home, told no one about it, and hid in my room as much as possible for weeks. I told my parents and others who noticed my cut, my swollen nose, that I had fallen off my bike. Then that in itself was gravely humiliating. It brought its own put downs and insults about my clumsiness and stupidity. So what he's saying here, his parents were telling him how stupid he was because he'd fallen off of his bike, rather than giving him any love or compassion. He says here that boys in this culture are often cruelly ridiculed for showing any kind of reaction to pain at all. Ridicule is often as intense for demonstrations of physical pain as it is for emotional pain. I can remember another time about the age of 6 when I fell and hurt myself in a game. I got up and I was on the verge of tears and was encircled by a ring of ominous-looking older boys. They were saying to him, "Look at the little pansy, look at him crying," scoffed one of them. I tried to hold back my tears with all of my might. I was almost successful, but then one boy noticed my upper lip quivering slightly. "Look, his lip shaking, he's going to cry." To their glee, I did cry. They had fun teasing me about that for what seemed like an eternity. I didn't cry again for many, many years. Scorn about pain has become so acceptable in this culture that sadistic television videos with highlights of athletes painfully colliding with inanimate objects of each other pass for entertainment. So we can see how we, on television, I don't watch TV, I'm social media and YouTube, educate myself on that. But we can see how, people almost have glee about people fighting. We see it in boxing or in sport, it's quite distasteful really, but it seems the way, some of the world is. He says here that canned laughter often accompanies the moments of impact and injury in television shows, further encouraging the audience to laugh at someone else's expense. And also we can see those videos, you know, I've seen them on virals or news feeds where people are getting hurt or hit or hurting themselves, and people actually think it's funny. And personally, I think it's, you know, quite mean that people can laugh at other people's pain, but some people in the world do that. So continuing reading, he says such practices increase our fear of being ridiculed and cause most of us to go to extraordinary lengths to hide our hurts. If we become especially effective at disguising our pain, we can even hide our hurts from ourselves. Some professional athletes become so inured, he says, to pain that they continue to compete even when with a broken nose. If human beings can learn to deny physical pain of that magnitude, how much easier it is to numb out emotional pain. When children grow up with parents who use sarcasm to punish and control them, they learn that hurling hurtful insults is normal and acceptable behavior. So for instance, you might recall, you know, yourself maybe crying as a child or hurting yourself and being told, you know, snap out of it, what's wrong with you? You know, it isn't that bad. You know, the sort of sarcastic, incompassionate people make us, as children, when we hear that enough, we become incompassionate to ourselves and we don't know how to care for ourselves properly. So he says here, eventually they cease to register sarcasm as painful to themselves or others. There is a time before this happens, however, when children are still emotionally whole enough to feel the stinging hurtfulness of destructive teasing. For a brief period, their natural instincts lead them to strongly protest unfair teasing. Most toddlers fight against teasing as if it were the most abnormal, saying that, thing in their lives. Unfortunately, children's angry objections to hurtful teasing are easily squelched by their all-powerful parents and typically become fodder for the relentless sarcasm and eventually vanquishes them. When children cry about being teased, they give their parents even more ammunition with which to attack and degrade them. This is especially true for boys. Their tears often earn them the brand of sissy or crybaby. And that's a terrible thing to do to small boys. You know, it's like girls are allowed to cry and boys are not. And, you know, I don't know where that comes from, but it's complete nonsense when we really can think about that. And being told that as children, then we have adults that are not prepared to be vulnerable or show their feelings. Continuing reading. He says most children have their normal reactions against sarcasm extinguished early in life. This destruction occurs quite rapidly when children have older siblings who also poke fun at them and their as yet unhidden vulnerabilities. Even children who come from sarcasm-free families are physically teased out of any sensitivity to destructive teasing by peers who mimic their sarcastic parents, siblings, and television heroes. Sooner or later, most of us grow up to accept the judgment that we are being over-serious, oversensitive, or humorless whenever we have any defensive reaction to teasing. Emotional expression may be society's favorite target for sarcasm. Just as boys are commonly teased out of their tears, girls are customarily teased out of their anger and exhorted to be nice. So if you might think, like, girls are told not to be angry and boys are told not to cry. So we end up, you know, displaced with our own emotions, and we don't, you know, we become adults, and when we should be rightfully angry about something, we back off as females and don't stand up for ourselves. And guys or boys who've been told not to cry grow into men who basically pretend they don't have any feelings and they don't want to talk about their feelings. So it says both genders are expected to have all of their emotions totally in control before they are even ready for school. And woe on the adult who loses emotional control, for widespread mockery is often the consequence. Political experts summarize that a female candidate recently lost an election because she cried in public. It did not matter that her tears were especially appropriate for the occasion. Newscasters revealed in the feast of sarcasm about her weakness. It says various situations which are most minor political frustrations would reduce her to tears. So we can see that we're almost taught that any proper emotion, unless it's like, you know, all of this filtered stuff going on, like on Instagram and Facebook, happy, 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 and bypassing what's real, you know, people judge people when they're in pain, or tell them to let it go and forgive and bypass. And I'm really against that. Bypassing is not the way to go. Okay. So I'm going to continue reading. He says, we are offered virtually no guidance in our society about how to use communication to effectively work through our conflicts. We are not even taught that it is normal to have differences and disappointments with our friends and lovers. Conventional wisdom says that if we really like and love our friends and intimates, we will never have difficulties with them. The unrealistic expectations make us express the anger of our normal pains and strains with each other. I'll read that again. The unrealistic expectations makes us repress the anger or our emotional pains and strains with others. So that, you know, we might be up against something with a friend and we just feel that we can't say what we need to say. It doesn't mean having a go at people, but just saying that about our needs and stuff like that. So repressed anger about our relationships' disappointments, however, does not mysteriously disappear or work itself out. It always creates a pressure in the unconscious that seeks release. The release often occurs when our unexpressed criticisms unconsciously leak out into our speech and cause us to say cutting things to each other in the name of humor. At such times, our repressed frustration can charge our laughter with angry derision and our tone of voice with shame. Even a whispered dig can carry emotional venom. Sarcasm commonly substitutes for assertiveness in many everyday situations. Instead of confronting an issue of lateness directly, we might ridicule our friend with labels like flake or space cadet. Instead of directly confronting flirtatiousness or talking about our own jealousy, we might make nasty jokes about our partner's appearance. Instead of asking for better listening, we might tease the other about being senile or scatterbrain. Instead of saying no to the request to do something we do not want to do, we might call the proposed activity clever for someone with a low IQ. Instead of admitting we do not know something, we might reply, what kind of idiot would ask a question like that? Or, what do I look like? An encyclopedia. So we can see how we use sarcasm and how sarcasm really doesn't deal with the issues. It just makes things worse. So we need to get mindful, you know, coming from a childhood that was rough and really abusive. We have something called arrested development, and arrested development means that part of us has been cut off. And for instance, if we've not been nurtured properly and we've had to shut down as adults when we're in an abusive situation, we won't stand up for ourselves. Or the other thing is that we don't know how to take care of ourselves properly and we shut down and we abandon ourselves. So then he says, if we remain unconscious about the hurtfulness of our teasing, we may become habituated to using sarcastic humor to disguise and release our aggression. If our victim squirms in discomfort or protests our abrasiveness, we may then justify ourselves with condescending disclaimers. Like for instance, he says, like, what's the matter with you? Can't you see I'm just kidding? Don't you have a sense of humor? You always take everything so seriously. Can't you take a joke? Destructive sarcasm habitually adds insult to injury. So we need to get mindful, like we can all do it. And clearly, if we're accepting, insults and criticisms and not standing up for ourselves, we need to look at that as well. And that's part of the inner parenting coming in and taking care of that inner child that wasn't treated properly. and beginning to say, hey, I don't like the way you said that, and such like. Then he says, I believe we all at heart crave the safety of not being made a laughing stock unless we recognize unfair teasing and sarcasm for the verbal and emotional abuse that it is, we may continue to allow others to bait and ridicule us. So as adults, if we've come from that in childhood, sarcasm and being ridiculed, we will accept it as adults, and we often will accept it at work, and we'll accept it amongst our friends and in relationships. And when we begin to accept or not stand up for ourselves, then things can get out of hand. And that's why there are so many people that have crises in relationships, because it's not being looked at properly. And this is what psychoeducation does. It allows us to objectify and grow beyond what we were taught as children. Reading on, he says, we may also get drawn into playing the awful game of swapping sarcastic insults. So you can see that, like how many relationships start out decent and loving, and then one person will make a sarcastic comment, and then it's like backwards and forwards, and then eventually there's big fights. So we need to nip it in the bud. And when we see ourselves doing it as well, like if we're going to say something that's sarcastic and nasty, we're all human, but, looking at ourselves, and then we can save relationships instead of them, getting way out of control. It's about being mindful and being kind. He says here, we may also get drawn into playing awful games of swapping sarcastic insults. How easy it is for this game to escalate into intimacy, slaying proportions. The unbridled use of sarcasm builds walls between people that prevent intimate sharing. Relationships are forced to remain superficial because only impersonal topics are safe enough to be discussed. And this is the truth. People find it really hard to talk about what they're really feeling. And when things come up, people are afraid to address it because they're afraid of what the other person might say. And often this, again, relates back to conditioning and societal beliefs of what we should just accept when some things are just totally unacceptable. So then he says, forgotten and unconscious wounds never really heal as destructive teasings continually poke and prod them. The comfort of being safe and relaxed around others remains elusive. So then I'm going to read a little bit more, and I'll continue with the rest of this book tomorrow. But he's talking about television and sarcasm, which is worth pointing out. I'm glad I got rid of my television in 2012. When I stopped drinking, I threw my television out as well. And I do watch YouTube though, so I'm not completely free of social media and stuff like that, but I am free of the mass consensus brainwashing. So he talks about here television and sarcasm. He says, for most of us, television is basically, is harmful, and there's a lot of sarcastic banter in it. Destructive sarcasm pollutes the dialogue of most of the American and British families portrayed on television. Although I can hardly bear to watch most situation comedies, I am often shocked at the viciousness of their sarcasm whenever I briefly pursue them. Friends and family members routinely gibe each other with snide, condescending remarks. The more cruel the insult, the harder the audience laughs. The more lacerating the sarcasm, the more the taunter is admired. The more vulnerable the speech or behavior of a character, the more he or she is mocked. Venomous character assassins, like, I don't know who this is, but he says Don Rickles, Howard Stern, and Andrew Dice Clay masquerade as comedians and have even become celebrities. Even David Letterman, for all his pure comic brilliance, sometimes degenerates into destructive sarcasm. He baits some interviewees so intensely they can hardly hide their discomfort, even though they are accomplished actors. Children are especially prone to intimidating what they see on television. When their media idols model the same sarcastic derision they get at home, they are thoroughly brainwashed into believing that ridicule is actually funny and acceptable. Boys are especially susceptible as many social forces encourage their aggressive and competitive tendencies, as television prompts them to prickle their peers with sarcastic humor, proficiency and viciousness and put downs, because goals for what these boys will end up striving for. Because of this, most boys grow up in a war zone of mockery and sniggering. And we can look at this in the world, you know, like the wars that go on and the sarcasm and the nastiness and the, you know, the murdering of each other in war zones, you know, people believing things that are, you know, that are just inhumane. Continuing reading. He says, because of this, most boys grow up in a war zone of mockery and sniggering. He who insults the quickest and deepest often wields the most power. And small group leaders are often those with the nastiest tongues. Via this process, destructive sarcasm becomes embedded in the communication styles of many men. As I glance curiously at the latest TV sitcoms, it appears that girls and women are now being drafted to fight on the battlefield of ocular degeneration, degeneration, get that word, I get it. But so if you haven't seen the last couple of videos, this chapter may not really make sense to you, but he goes on to say that sarcasm kills relationships, but generally this will be coming from childhood, hey? So we need to heal our wounds and look at those. He says healthy limits with sarcasm and teasing. And he goes on in this book, but I might choose another chapter tomorrow because this bit for me today sort of didn't make 100%, didn't work for me 100%, but it's out there that we need to look at ourselves. We need to look at our anxiety, PTSD, depression that we have as adults so that we can begin to come whole. Carl Gustav Jung, who was to do with psychoanalysis, and that's why we have it in the world, to do with Freud and Carl Jung, talk about, you know, looking at our shadow, or Carl Jung did in particular, and looking at and objectifying who we are and our lives. So hopefully this was useful to somebody out there today. I can see currently 2 viewers, but I'm going to stop this end stream. I'm going to do an astrology video now, as that's the other thing I am passionate about, apart from helping people understand what CPTSD is. And that's it for today. I'll be back tomorrow. Thank you very much, with questions and answers tomorrow. I'm going to put that out on live stream. Thank you.